brief process, we immediately convened a meeting of our Government Public Affairs Committee because we knew something needed to change. Laws were going to need to change. Best practices were going to need to change in response to this tragedy. So we convened 3 task forces, one that was focused on building integrity and maintenance, one that was focused on reserve studies and reserve funding, and a third that was focused on insurance-related issues. We immediately convened these groups and engaged hundreds of CAI members with expertise in these areas. And CAI, Community Associations Institute, we are an international organization. Our members include board members of condos, co-ops, and homeowners associations, the managing professionals, as well as all the business partners that serve this business area, this area of housing, accountants, insurance, attorneys, bankers, landscapers, painters, police, pool companies, etc. So we really have the umbrella of all these people serving the community association housing model. So we brought whoever was interested or had an expertise or an interest in serving on these committees together, these task forces together, and we started meeting weekly. Each task force met weekly for several months to explore different laws, different circumstances, to explore issues related to their service area, whether it's reserves or building inspections or insurance, to come up with public policy recommendations for our state legislative action committees, for our federal government affairs initiatives, and just for our members to consider, and people living and working in associations and condo and co-op buildings to consider. Again, we had hundreds of people involved in this process. We looked at a lot of data and information. For example, according to the American Communities Survey, nearly 2/3 of all residential buildings in the US, condominium and co-op buildings, are more than 30 years old, more than 2/3. Now, that's not to say that there are maintenance issues and that they're going to fall down, but it is to say there is a subset there. There's nearly 2/3, nearly 66% of the buildings are old enough that they likely need to have some form of inspection if they haven't already. We had conversations with a lot of people internationally and in the US, engineers, the National Institute of Science and Technology, the National League of Cities, Association of Counties, the building inspectors, etc., other organizations, to understand what they're hearing and what they are feeling relative to the condo collapse, and to get their perspective so that we can work together and develop public policy that makes sense for everybody. We also have like most organizations, we have a structure. We had to go through a number of vetting entities, committees, to vet these public policies and have them approved. So within 4 months, we developed these policy initiative recommendations. They went through the vetting process of all of our legislative action committees, of our chapters, of our member representation groups, ultimately for approval by our Board of Trustees on October 28th, 2021. Now, I mentioned the National Institute of Science and Technology. Most of you probably know that Congress did allocate funds for the National Institute of Science and Technology to do an investigation on this condo collapse. Our process was not to investigate the condo collapse. Our process was to look at what could be strengthened when it comes to best practices and laws, local, state, and federal laws, to make sure this doesn't happen again. We didn't evaluate anything that happened at that building in particular, and we're letting that to the experts. We did a few months ago start leaning on and of course taking information from the Miami-Dade County grand jury report, which was released, and they did a level of investigation on the condo collapse, which did help inform and continue to inform what we're doing as an organization. As I mentioned, our process resulted in the Condo Safety Public Policy Report, which you can find on our website right here.
That the safety of a building isn't something you just start looking at when a building gets old. What we focused on also is that when a building is built, when a building is designed, when things change during construction, but you need to set up your buildings, developers need to set up their buildings when they're building them to make sure that they are safe buildings going forward. So we came up with a number of recommendations in public policy in regards to what developers should do for their buildings. And some of the developer requirements include providing construction drawings of the structure. Now, in some jurisdictions, developers for a condo or a co-op provide these drawings at the end of construction. It's a requirement, but we're talking about the structural systems. And the thing that's very important here is that when there are always changes when something is being built. Nothing that's finished ever matches exactly what the drawings show, I promise you. So this includes that if there are any changes to what we call the primary load-bearing system of the building or the structure, that needs to be reviewed by an engineer. The best engineer to look at it is the engineer that did the design of the initial building, but it needs to be reviewed by the engineer. And if there's a change, it has to be documented with field drawings, with all kinds of things, and confirm that the building, even though it's changed, is still providing a structurally safe building. The other reason for the construction drawings is for future reference by the association. And let me give you one quick example. A concrete building. Sometimes you have a concrete building, you look at a concrete column that holds up the building, and you think that it's a regular, what's called reinforced concrete column. But when you look at the drawings, you see that it's a structural steel building, but the structural steel is encased within the concrete. So with these drawings, it tells you exactly what the building's structural system is. And that's why it's very important that you have them for future reference by the community. And so that's in terms of the documentation that's provided as far as the structure of the building. The next is inspections during construction. The inspections during construction should be performed by a licensed professional engineer with experience in structures to confirm that the building is being built in conformance with the design drawings. Now, I will tell you that there's different levels of inspections that are done. For example, if it's a structural steel building where you can see the steel, you can see the bolts that hold it together, things like that, it's much easier. It's easy to look at it when the construction is complete. But if you have a reinforced concrete building with a lot of the steel, and if I use terms that you're not familiar with, please feel free to jump in, but the steel is hidden within the concrete. So you need to inspect it in a much more detailed way during construction to make sure that things you can't see when it's done have been installed correctly. So that's why inspections during construction, we confirm it's built in conformance with the drawings. Dawn's moving me ahead pretty quickly, but I also want to mention the last slide that there's a comment in here in regards to preventive maintenance manual. In many, many places, and I'll touch on it, there are reserve studies that are included within the operating budget, but they don't include preventive maintenance and the cost of preventive maintenance. So one of the things in the public policy is that when the developer prepares the budget for the new building, it not only includes the reserve study, which I'll touch on, but it also includes preventive maintenance plan, as well as the cost of that preventive maintenance plan. And then there's a disclosure to purchasers in regards to all of this information, as well as the recommended periodic inspection schedule for when the community takes over and the cost of it, which I'll touch on in the next slide. So now we get to the community is taking control and how often do you do inspections? Keep in mind the building is something that ages, so that as it ages, certain things can happen that require ongoing maintenance. And so what it makes recommendations for is the first is what's called the baseline inspection. A baseline inspection is something that documents the condition of the structure of the building. It's kept on record, so as the building gets older and future inspections are being done, they can look at that original inspection to see if deterioration has occurred, what's occurring, is there cracking that's occurring, is there rusting that you're seeing. And I'm not going to go into detail about that, but that's why the first inspection is known as what's called a baseline inspection to base your future inspections on. So as far as those future inspections, they're done to monitor the condition and progressive deterioration. Like I said, we're not here to reinvent the wheel. And one of the standards we refer to is a document put out by the American Society of Civil Engineers titled Guideline for Structural Condition Assessment of Existing Structures, which is a reference that's been used in the industry for a long time. As far as the frequency, for a new community, a new building, no later than 5 years after the certificate of occupancy is issued, so 5 years. For a building that's existing building that's more than 10 years old, then there should be inspection done within 2 years of putting in place these type of recommendations, these public policies. For other buildings, just the general guiding rule of thumb is for buildings up to 20 years old, there should be an inspection, a maximum of every 10 years. And after it's 20 years, it should be inspected a maximum of every 5 years. Now, those are maximums. So if any of the prior inspections are done that based on the condition of the building, it suggests that the inspections be done sooner than these time periods, they should be done sooner, but no longer than 10 years up to 20 years old and 5 years after that. And if there's a safety issue determined, then it should be obviously dealt with immediately. And there's certain public policy suggestions in terms of giving these documents and these inspections to local governmental authorities. And the critical thing back in the slide on the bottom line, one of the most critical things is, and you'll read a lot about this in Florida, is that in many instances, it costs, well, in all instances, it costs money to fix things. In many instances, the board is required to have a vote of the membership in order to get money to fix things. Very, very important part of the public policy is that the board has the authority to special assess or borrow money to make immediate repairs without a vote of the membership. I think that's one of the most critical parts of the public policy, because if you don't have money, you can't fix it.
In New York City, where I'm from, all right, we have this thing called FISP, which is the Facade Inspection and Safety Program, which used to be old Local Law 11. Buildings 7 stories or more, and there's some detail in that which was very confusing in the beginning. 7 stories or more have to be inspected, at least at that time in the beginning, is at each side of the building. And it was done by scaffolding, and it was a visual inspection. Well, in this cycle, what they call cycle 9, there are new things that have to be looked at, which of course is going to add to the cost of these inspections. And these inspections have to be by an approved licensed professional that the building pays for. These new items, depending on your construction of your particular building, if you have a cement curtain wall as the structure, and then you have a brick facade, there's what's known as a tie that holds the brick facade to the cement wall. They want all those ties to be examined. So that means you have to make probes within the facade and take a camera and go as far as you can. And these probes have to be every 60 feet. They have been developing new types of inspections. You have inspections that the old way, scaffolding. Number 2, what they call the bucket, that someone sits in the actual bucket and is lowered from the roof, and they go around and they make these holes. And the latest thing that I just saw earlier this year or late last year was cameras that also have infrared cameras that can see past the bricks to see those ties are solid and they're not broken. Another new development is that if your particular building have balconies or terraces, they must be inspected also. You heard about in New York City last year, a terrace balcony collapse, killing people. Well, you know, New York, in New York City, if something has happened, boom, okay, let's make a law or a regulation. Now, also new is a New York State parking garage inspection. Now, I can tell you in New York City, we were allowed to make our own garage inspections, which happen to be more restrictive and more onerous on buildings. They're really looking at how is the structural integrity of that garage. A few years ago, a very, very large garage in Lower Manhattan collapsed. And this has been a bane of the building department of New York City's existence for many, many years. And they finally got something passed by the New York City. And the other thing that happens is that a while ago, maybe more than 20 years ago, if not just a shy year or less, the American Institute of CPAs made a disclosure requirement, and that disclosure requirement said, hey, co-ops, condos, you have to have a reserve study and put it in your financial statements. Well, those co-op and condo associations that are based in New York City, we were advised by the attorneys, and if you don't disclose it, you don't have reserve funding, you have to put a footnote, you have to put a note in the financial payment of how, if something happens, how you were going to pay for it. Well, a lot of attorneys didn't like this because they were in fear of litigation. You know, in New York City, we like to sue each other, like changing our underwear. So with that, I can also see that the tide may be changing, and maybe it may be time for us to embrace at least a reserve study. I can tell you in my particular cooperative, before Chaplin and before we were looking at and negotiating with a firm to do a reserve study. And then unfortunately, our cooperative was hit with Ida, Hurricane Ida. And so all plans were like thrown aside, and we're now just dealing with the aftermath of a complete destruction of our building and equipment from Ida. And I also would like to say that Mitch, on a call that we had, told me that North Shore Towers has retained his services to do a reserve study. North Shore Towers is a very, very large cooperative that's right on the Queens and Nassau County board. It's a city within the city. They have their own golf course. They have 2 swimming pools, movie theaters, banks. It really is a city upon a city. So I think that you're going to hear, and what I've been hearing is that people want to go back to this reserve study.
The first question is, does insurance actually cover rebuilding after a collapse? It's a fair question, and I'm sure a question that popped into a lot of people's heads, especially board members and managing agents after the Florida building collapse. And everything I'm about to say with respect, when I say with respect to policy coverages, is of course subject to the actual policy terms and conditions, but I'm going to speak in generalities about what we typically see on insurance policies for condominiums and co-ops. And with respect to that question about whether a collapse is covered for rebuilding, the answer is generally yes, as long as the policy doesn't exclude collapse. And most of the time, a standard policy is not going to exclude a collapse, subject to some conditions which I'll discuss. So also, assuming that the building covers collapse, it's only going to cover the replacement of the building if the building limit or the amount of the insurance on the building is adequate to address the full replacement cost. And an issue that is really a nationwide issue, it's a big issue in New York. It's an issue that carriers have been addressing somewhat proactively over the last decade or 15 years or so, is that many of these buildings are underinsured. Your insurance broker is not a builder, and neither is your insurance company. So you can expect your broker or the insurance company to give you, an estimate of what the replacement cost is, but that's going to be based on generic software that's used to project the replacement cost of a building. But when you're getting into buildings that are tens and tens of millions of dollars to replace or more, it's very difficult for software to be extremely accurate. And you want it to be as close as possible to accurate for insurance purposes. So I guess when in doubt, overinsure or make sure you have a replacement cost appraisal done so that you know what your building will cost to replace, especially given the inflationary conditions that the country is under right now. Next, as I said, the answer is yes, collapse is covered, provided that the board was unaware of decay that caused the collapse. So generally speaking, an insurance policy is going to cover collapse except if there was a known condition. And unfortunately, in Florida, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the decay and deterioration, in particular, metal deterioration, structural steel deterioration, was the cause of the collapse, and that the board knew of it and unfortunately didn't do anything until it was too late. So that's a question for the Surfside Condos Building Insurance Company to address. But it is something that brings us to lesson number one, which is if a landlord or a condo or co-op board suspects or is advised of possible building structural problem, the concern should be assessed by a professional and any repair recommendations should be addressed in a timely manner. And failure to address building structural problems could result in a coverage exclusion in a multi-million-dollar uninsured construction project. Second, some key property coverages related to collapse relative to insurance policies. Assuming that the known decay exclusion is not applicable, so there was no knowledge that there was deterioration or corrosion that caused the collapse. If only a portion of the building collapses, which is very possible, and certainly if you look at the picture on the screen, you can see, and everybody knows by now, the Surfside, Florida building collapse, it was literally like half the building. The other half of the building was basically completely unaffected and undamaged. You can see it in the picture there. So if only a portion of the building collapses, then the remaining undamaged portion of the building, as we know from the Surfside example, may be required to be demolished. Well, here you have undamaged property that the building code is requiring, the building department is requiring to be demolished and then hopefully rebuilt. So first of all, it costs money to demolish a building, especially an undamaged part of a building. So you have to have demolition insurance as part of your property insurance policy to cover those demolition costs. Secondly, you have to have coverage to replace the undamaged building, because insurance generally does not pay for things that are not damaged to be destroyed and then rebuilt. So a part of insurance relative to ordinance or law coverage is called demolition, and another part's called undamaged building replacement, or loss to the undamaged portion of the building. And then thirdly, once you have to rebuild, once you start rebuilding the building, especially in buildings, as has been discussed throughout the evening, buildings that are 30, 40, 50 years old. In New York, we have many buildings that are well over 50, tending toward 100 years old. These buildings are way, way, way out of building codes for today. So they would need to be reconstructed to today's building codes. And that's insurance. Basic insurance covers to replace exactly what was lost. It doesn't cover to replace with something better or more up to date, unless you have a third part of what's called ordinance or law coverage, which is increased cost of construction due to building codes. So critical coverages are demolition, replacement to the undamaged portion of the building, and increased cost of construction due to the codes. And then, of course, this building here, if it's ever rebuilt, is going to take probably several years to rebuild. And during that time, there's obviously ongoing expenses, not just the cost to rebuild the building, but that building sits on very expensive, valuable land right on the water. It's got taxes. There are ongoing insurance costs. The condominium association, if it's going to continue to exist, is going to have to probably have some sort of staff on board. So those all cost money, and the unit owners are going to have to pay for that unless the building has in place business income loss and extra expense coverage.